The sun was sinking low over the old village, its last rays spilling like molten copper across the weathered rooftops and wooden porches. The dusty main road stretched quiet and empty, save for the creak of a swinging sign above the blacksmith's shop and the occasional bark of a stray dog wandering between the shadows. Folks said this land still held memories of blood and fire, echoes of battles fought when the territory was younger and wilder. But the village had grown used to silence, to days that dragged by with little more than gossip, barter, and the whistle of the wind. No one expected that by nightfall something would happen that would shatter the stillness and bind two lives together. In ways neither could have imagined. It began with the sound of hooves pounding hard against the earth. A rider came storming down from the ridge, his horse foaming with sweat, his shirt clinging with dust and grit. He wasn't a stranger to the village, though he'd never called it home. Folks knew him as the quiet one who worked odd jobs, the kind of man who kept to himself but always stepped forward when someone needed a hand. Some said he'd seen too much in his time, carrying burdens no one dared ask about. That evening, his return wasn't silent. He pulled into town with a figure slumped across his saddle, a woman barely conscious, her long braids tangled, her face bruised but proud even in her weakness. She was Apache, and that alone made the air grow heavy. Townsfolk gathered quick, eyes full of questions they didn't dare voice aloud. Whispers curled through the crowd like smoke. What business did he have bringing her here? Trouble always followed such things. Yet there she was, half hidden beneath his coat, clinging faintly to life. He slid from the saddle, cradled her carefully, and carried her toward the doctor's small cabin at the edge of the street. No one tried to stop him. No one knew how, by lamplight, the story slowly began to piece itself together. He had been out by the canyon's edge, scouting for strayed cattle, when he heard the clash of shouts and the strike of rifles. Bandits had taken her captive, treating her as spoils, bound and beaten as they dragged her deeper into the wilderness. Something inside him wouldn't allow it. He stepped in where most would have turned away, and by the time the dust cleared, the outlaws lay scattered in the dirt, and she lay breathing though broken. He had saved her life, though he hadn't expected gratitude, nor forgiveness, nor anything at all. Yet when she awoke, her dark eyes locked on his, and she spoke words that startled him more than the fight itself. Her voice was hoarse but steady, carrying weight older than the town, older than the borders drawn on any map. "You saved me," she whispered. "So now, according to the sacred law, I must bear you a child." The room fell silent. The doctor froze mid-bandage. The kerosene lamp flickered as though even the flame listened. The man felt the words strike. Deep, heavier than bullets, stranger than any oath he'd ever heard. He tried to dismiss them, tried to say she owed him nothing. But she shook her head, firm despite her wounds, repeating that the law of her people was not for him to deny. It was as though the earth itself demanded it. As though every shadow and star bore witness. Outside, the village stirred with unease. News traveled fast, faster than truth, faster than fire. By morning, whispers would grow into stories, and stories would grow into judgment. Some would say he had brought ruin to the town by interfering, others that destiny itself had chosen, a path neither could refuse. Either way, the weight of her words hung in the air, impossible to ignore, binding them in a way neither had asked for but neither could escape. He sat at her bedside long after the doctor had left, the night pressing close around the cabin walls. She lay still, yet her gaze never left him. There was no pleading in her eyes, no fear. Only a quiet strength, the kind that belonged to people who had survived storms and loss beyond counting. He felt caught between two worlds, the one he knew, of fences and markets and the measured rhythm of village life, and the one she carried, vast and untamed, full of sacred laws and unbroken ties to the land. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, a coyote cried, sharp and lonely. The sound sent a shiver through him, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was the weight of choice pressing down, or maybe it was the sense that the world itself had shifted, pulling him toward a future he couldn't yet see. He thought of the bandits lying dead in the canyon, of the blood on his hands, and of her words that clung to him like fate. "You saved me, so now I must give you life in return," she had said, as though it was carved into stone before either of them was born. The candle burned low, shadows lengthening against the cabin walls. He wondered what morning would bring, whether the town would stand against him, whether he had taken a step down a road from which there was no turning back. And then, as the silence grew heavier, she spoke again, her voice carrying both warning and promise. "If you refuse, it will not only dishonor me, it will dishonor the spirits who watched tonight." The words hung in the air like a blade. He realized then that this was no ordinary bond, no passing gratitude or fleeting vow. This was something older, something sacred, something that would test not only his heart but his very soul. He didn't know yet what choice he would make or what price it might demand. But deep inside, he knew nothing in his life would ever be the same. And outside, as dawn crept closer, the restless village waited, their whispers curling like smoke, ready to catch fire at the smallest spark. The night stretched long, and neither of them found sleep. He sat by the small wooden chair at her bedside, listening to the slow rise and fall of her breathing. The lamplight painted her face in soft amber, showing the streaks of dirt, the bruises, the raw strength that even pain could not take away. She seemed both fragile and unbreakable at the same time, like the desert flowers that bloomed only after storms. Outside, the village was quiet, but he could feel the unease in the air, the way silence sometimes carried more weight than noise. Tomorrow questions would come, and so would judgment. He thought of his own life, simple in appearance but filled with shadows. He had wandered into this village years before, never speaking much of where he came from. Folks had learned not to ask. They knew he could mend fences, break horses, fix wagons, and stand his ground in a fight. He was a man useful to have nearby, but not one people welcomed fully. The truth was, he had been searching for peace, some place where his hands could work and his mind could rest. He had found a little of that here, but not enough to quiet the ghosts that sometimes followed him in his sleep. And now, with her words, peace felt farther away than ever. The Apache woman stirred slightly, her eyes opening just enough to catch him staring. Her gaze was sharp even in weakness. "Why do you look at me as if I am a burden?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite her wounds. He shook his head, not knowing how to answer. He wasn't sure what he felt: fear, respect, confusion, maybe even a strange pull toward something he could not name. "You don't understand," she said, her accent shaping the words like stone shaped by water. "The law is older than me, older than you, older than this place. It is not about choice. You stepped into my fate when you raised your hand to save me. Now the spirits will hold us both to it." He wanted to ask her what that meant, what bearing a child had to do with spirits or fate, but the way she spoke silenced him. It wasn't spoken like a request or demand. It was truth to her, as real as the ground beneath them. And part of him knew, deep down, that she was not speaking lightly. Morning broke with a pale light spilling across the dusty windows. The first sound was the toll of the small church bell calling villagers to prayer. Then came footsteps crunching on dirt, voices low and cautious. Word had already spread, faster than wildfire. By the time he stepped outside to fetch water, people had gathered in small knots along the street. Their eyes followed him, some curious, some suspicious, others cold and hard. Old Mrs. Dyer, who sold herbs and thread from her porch, muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "Mark my words, nothing good comes from mixing with their kind. Trouble always follows." A younger man, leaning against the post of the saloon, spit into the dirt and said, "Best send her back where she belongs, before we all get caught in the middle of it." He ignored them, though the words stung. He wasn't blind to their fear. This village had known its share of raids years before, times when Apache bands had swept through, burning and taking what they pleased. Many here carried scars of loss, and the memory of those days had not faded. To them, she was not just a woman, she was a reminder of wounds not healed. When he returned to the cabin, the woman was sitting up, weak but alert. "They do not want me here," she said simply. "They don't understand," he answered. "They understand enough," she said, her tone sharp, almost bitter. "Your people and mine have been at war longer than either of us has been alive. They will never see me as anything else." He didn't argue. He knew she was right. But there was something in him that resisted letting her go. Maybe it was guilt for dragging her here instead of finding a way to return her safely to her own people. Maybe it was the memory of her words, binding them with a law he didn't fully believe in but couldn't shake. Or maybe it was something else, something unspoken that stirred when he looked at her. Days passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. She healed little by little under the doctor's care, though the villagers whispered louder with each sunrise. Some claimed she brought bad luck. Others said she was spying for her people, waiting for the right moment to strike. The preacher spoke of keeping faith and guarding against temptation, though his eyes carried more fear than faith. Still, she remained in the cabin, and he stayed by her side, even as the walls of suspicion closed in around them both. One evening, as the sky bled red over the horizon, she told him about her world. She spoke of the mountains her people called sacred, of the rivers that carried stories older than memory, of ceremonies where fire and song bound them together. She spoke of law, not written on paper but carried in the hearts of her people. Law that demanded balance between life and death, giving and receiving. When a life is saved, she said, the debt is not small. A life must answer with life. That is why I told you what I did. He listened, torn between belief and doubt. Part of him respected her conviction. Another part feared what it meant for his own life, tangled now with hers in ways he hadn't chosen. He wondered if she expected him to walk away from the village, from everything he had built, and follow her into a world he could never truly belong to. He wondered if she even had a choice in it herself. But what unsettled him most was the way her eyes softened when she spoke to him, not as a prisoner or stranger, but as though she already carried something of him inside her heart. It frightened him more than the anger of the townsfolk. One night, while the wind howled through the canyon, he heard the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. He rose quietly, hand on the rifle by the door. A shadow lingered, then another. When he stepped out, 3 men stood there, faces hard in the moonlight. "We came to warn you," one said. "The council met today. They don't want her here no more. If she's not gone by the next sundown, we'll see to it ourselves." He said nothing, only watched them until they turned and walked away. But inside, his chest burned with anger. When he returned, she was awake, her eyes already knowing. "It has begun," she whispered. "What has?" he asked. "The testing," she said. "The spirits are watching now to see if you are strong enough to walk this path. If you are not, they will take everything from you." Her words echoed in his mind long after the fire burned down to embers. He felt the ground shift beneath him, as though the world itself had tilted and left him standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. He didn't know if he believed in spirits or sacred laws or destiny. But he knew one thing with certainty. His life, once quiet and hidden, was no longer his own. The village was stirring toward something, a storm gathering slowly, and he stood, caught between 2 worlds that might soon tear each other apart. And somewhere in that storm was her, the woman he had saved, the woman whose words bound them. Together with a law older than time. The warning from the men lingered in the cabin like smoke that refused to clear. He could feel their words pressing against the walls, heavy and suffocating. The woman sat quietly by the fire, her face calm though her eyes revealed something deeper, a knowing, a patience born from years of hardship. He couldn't tell if she feared the threats or if she had expected them all along. Outside, the night winds rattled the dry branches, carrying the sound of distant coyotes. It seemed as though even the wilderness was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The next morning, he went into town with his usual steadiness, though every step drew eyes toward him. The saloon doors creaked as he passed, men muttering into their mugs. The blacksmith paused mid-strike, hammer frozen in the air. Children whispered and stared from behind their mothers' skirts. The preacher stood on the church steps, speaking to a small gathering, his words about sin and judgment carrying just loud enough to be heard. Though no one stopped him, their stares were a kind of cage. He went about his tasks quietly, collecting supplies and speaking little, but he could feel the weight of the village closing in. When he returned to the cabin, she was waiting, her gaze steady. "They will not let this pass," she said. "They'll calm down," he replied, though even as the words left him, he knew they weren't true. "They fear what they do not understand," she said. "They see me as an enemy, not as a woman. And they see you as a traitor for standing by me." He sat heavily in the chair, running a hand across his tired face. "I never asked for this," he admitted, his voice low. Her expression softened, though she did not look away. "Neither did I, yet here we are. You saved me. Now our lives are bound. Whether you believe the law or not, it is already in motion." In the days that followed, tension thickened in the air. Some villagers tried to ignore what was happening, going about their daily routines, but the undercurrent of unease ran through every corner of the town. A few voices grew louder, men who saw themselves as protectors of the community, quick to stir fear into action. They gathered in the saloon, speaking of danger, of raids, of what could happen if Apache bands came looking for their lost daughter. It wasn't long before talk turned to plans, and plans to threats. At the same time, small acts of kindness appeared in quiet places. The doctor, though cautious, continued to treat her wounds without hesitation. A young girl from the bakery left fresh bread on the cabin's doorstep one morning before dawn, running off before she could be seen. These gestures didn't erase the fear, but they reminded him that not every heart in the village was hardened. Still, kindness was a fragile thing against the weight of suspicion. One evening, as the last light faded, he found her outside the cabin, sitting on a wooden step, staring toward the hills. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She didn't turn to him at first. "I think of my people," she said. "I wonder if they search for me, or if they believe I am gone forever. I think of what they would say if they saw me here, in this place, bound by a law they honor, but you doubt." He sat beside her, the air cool and still. "Do you want to return to them?" She glanced at him then, her eyes sharp but unreadable. "Do you want me to?" The question unsettled him. He didn't know what he wanted. Part of him longed for the quiet life he had before, the simple rhythm of work and rest. Yet another part felt drawn to her, not just by the law she spoke of, but by something deeper, something that stirred when she looked at him with that unshaken strength. That night, dreams came to him, restless and strange. He dreamed of fire sweeping through the village, of men shouting, of shadows moving across the land. He dreamed of her standing in the center, her hands lifted to the sky, calling out words he couldn't understand. When he woke, the sound of her voice from the dream still echoed in his ears, and for the first time he wondered if there truly were spirits watching, as she claimed. The following day brought a new turn. A rider came in from the north, dust rising behind him, carrying word that a small band of Apache had been spotted not far from the ridge. Fear spread quick through the town. Men gathered with rifles, women pulled their children close. The council called for a meeting at the church, their voices loud and urgent. It didn't take long for whispers to point back to her. "They'll come for her," someone said. "They'll come for blood," another added. By sundown, the tension reached a breaking point. He stood outside the cabin, rifle in hand, watching the road. She stood behind him, silent but steady, as though ready for whatever came. The villagers had not yet acted, but he could feel the storm building. Inside his chest, two wars raged. One was with the town, the people he had worked beside, who now looked at him as though he were a stranger. The other was with himself, torn between fear and duty, doubt and belief. Her law had become his burden, yet also his anchor, keeping him rooted when everything else threatened to spin out of control. As days turned into weeks, smaller conflicts bloomed into subplots of their own. The preacher pressed the council to demand her removal, insisting it was the only way to protect the town. The blacksmith, once silent, began speaking against him in the saloon, saying that a man who chose an outsider over his own people could not be trusted. At the same time, whispers spread that a few villagers had been sneaking supplies to the cabin, unwilling to see a woman suffer even if they feared her. The town was dividing itself, line by line, word by word. Through it all, she healed, strength returning. She spent time outside the cabin now, walking slowly, her gaze fixed often on the hills as though she could see beyond them. Sometimes she sang softly in her own tongue, melodies that carried across the dusty air like threads of another world. The sound unsettled some, enchanted others, but always reminded him that she belonged to a world larger than this village. One evening, as the moon rose full and bright, she spoke again of the law. "The child is not only for you," she said, "it is for balance. For life to answer life, that is why the spirits watch. If we turn from it, they will not bless us. They will take." He looked at her, unsure whether to believe or fear. "What? Will they take?" She didn't answer, only turned her gaze to the horizon where the hills met the sky. Her silence was heavier than words, and he felt the weight of it settle deep inside him. The village remained restless, torn between fear and hesitation. But the rumor of the Apache band to the north grew stronger with each passing day. Some claimed they had seen smoke signals at night, others that horses had been spotted on the ridge. Whether it was truth or fear, no one could say for certain. But the talk grew louder. If the band came, they would bring war. And at the center of it all was her, the woman whose life he had saved, the woman whose law now bound him, the woman who had become both symbol and target. As the days shortened and the nights grew colder, he felt the walls closing in. Every choice seemed heavy with consequence, every silence louder than words. He didn't know whether to trust the spirits she spoke of or the instincts that told him danger was near. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: something was coming. And when it arrived, neither he nor the village would remain unchanged. And in the stillness before dawn, when the air was sharp and the land silent, he thought he heard it. The distant rhythm of drums carried faintly on the wind, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, echoing across the desert like a warning. The nights grew colder, and with them the silence of the village deepened. Yet beneath that silence was a tension as sharp as a drawn blade. He could feel it in the way people avoided his eyes when he walked through town, in the way conversations hushed the moment he entered a room. The preacher's sermons grew louder, filled with warnings of judgment and ruin. Men sharpened their rifles more openly now, not just for hunting or guarding cattle, but for something unspoken. The sense of waiting grew heavier each day. As though the entire place was bracing for a storm no one could outrun Dot at the cabin, the woman's strength had returned. Her wounds had healed into scars, and her voice carried steady whenever she spoke. But she too felt the weight of what was coming. At night, when the fire burned low, she would sit quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Sometimes she whispered words in her own tongue, prayers or warnings he could not understand. Other times she spoke plainly. "They will come soon," she said one evening, her tone calm but certain. "My people do not forget their own. They will come for me. The only question is whether they come with peace or with war." Her words left him unsettled. He had grown used to her presence, to the rhythm of their days in the small cabin. He no longer saw her as a stranger, but he also knew the village would never see her as anything else. If her people appeared, the villagers would believe it meant attack. And if the villagers acted first, it could spark bloodshed none of them were ready for. One afternoon, while gathering supplies in town, he overheard a heated exchange outside the saloon. The blacksmith, his face red with drink, stood with a group of men, voices low but urgent. "We can't just wait for them to ride in here," the blacksmith said. "You know what'll happen if we do. Best to strike first while we've got the chance." Another man, younger but no less firm, replied, "You mean kill her? That'll only bring them faster." "Then let her go," a third man suggested. "Send her back tied to a horse. Send a message that we don't want her here. Maybe that'll keep them off our backs." He slipped away before they noticed him listening, but the words burned into his mind. The village was running out of patience, and their fear was curdling into something dangerous. That night, he told her what he'd heard. She didn't flinch, didn't show fear. Instead, she looked at him with that steady gaze of hers. "They will do what they believe will save them," she said. "But fear blinds men. Fear makes them strike at shadows." He felt frustration boil in him. "And what about us? What happens when they come here with rifles in their hands? What happens when they decide we're the enemy?" Her reply was quiet, but her words cut through him. "Then you must choose who you truly are. A man who runs or a man who stands." Her certainty frightened him more than the threats outside. She spoke as though she already knew the path laid before them both, as though fate had carved it into stone. He wanted to fight against it, but part of him knew he couldn't. The following days brought signs that the moment she had warned of was close. Smoke was seen rising in the hills. Horses' tracks appeared near the ridge. A boy claimed he heard the sound of drums carried faintly on the wind. Each rumor spread faster than the last, and the village twisted itself tighter with fear. Families began to store food and water, doors were barred at night, and rifles leaned against windowsills. The air itself seemed ready to shatter. Then, one night, he woke to the sound of hoofbeats outside the cabin. He rose quickly, rifle in hand, and stepped out into the cold. At first, he saw nothing but the dark line of the trees. Then, slowly, 3 riders emerged, their figures tall and still against the moonlight. Apache. They did not move closer, did not call out, but their presence was enough. He stood tense, the rifle heavy in his grip, until finally the riders turned and disappeared back into the night. When he returned inside, she was awake, watching him. "They are watching," she said simply. "They are waiting to see how you will act." The next morning, the village erupted. Word spread of the riders, and fear turned into near panic. Men gathered in the church, voices rising, arguments breaking into shouts. Some demanded action, others begged for patience, but no one agreed. The preacher called it a test from God, a trial to prove their faith. The blacksmith called it war. Plain and simple. By evening, the council declared that if the Apache did not leave by the next sundown, the town would force her out. When he heard the decision, He felt his chest tighten. They weren't giving her a chance to speak, to explain, to prove she meant no harm. They were giving her a deadline, as if she were nothing more than a danger to be removed. He returned to the cabin, his thoughts heavy, his anger simmering. She met his silence with calm. "It is as I said," she told him. "The spirits are watching. They will see what you do now." Her words left him torn in two. If he stayed silent, the town would act, and she would be cast out or worse. If he resisted, he would be standing against the very people he had lived beside for years. Either choice felt like betrayal. That night, he paced the cabin, unable to rest. Outside, the wind carried strange sounds, the distant call of owls, the rustle of branches, and faintly, the beat of drums again, steady and low. He thought of the riders. In the night, the way they had watched without speaking. He thought of the villagers, waiting for him to yield. And he thought of her, sitting calmly by the fire, her eyes never wavering, as though she already knew the answer he hadn't yet found. The day of the deadline dawned gray and cold. The town gathered in the square, rifles in hand, faces hard and weary. He stood at the edge of the crowd, the woman beside him, her presence drawing every eye. Murmurs rippled through the people, some angry, some fearful, all tense. The councilman stepped forward, his voice loud and stern. "This woman must leave. If she stays, we will all be put at risk. We cannot allow it." The preacher raised his hand, adding weight to the councilman's words. "This is not just about safety. This is about the soul of our village. Do not be led astray." Every gaze turned to him then, waiting, demanding an answer. He could feel the pressure bearing down on him, the expectation that he would step aside, that he would let them handle it. But when he looked at her, standing tall despite the cold, her face calm, her eyes steady, something inside him shifted. The silence stretched long, broken only by the sound of the wind and the creak of the church. Bells swaying faintly in the breeze. Then, faint but unmistakable, came another sound, the rhythm of drums again. Closer this time, rolling through the hills like thunder. The villagers froze, their faces draining of color. Some clutched their rifles tighter, others glanced toward the horizon with fear in their eyes. The woman spoke then, her voice strong and clear. "They are here." The words struck the crowd like a spark in dry grass. Panic threatened to break, men shouting, women clutching their children. The councilman tried to calm them. The preacher raised his voice in prayer, but the fear was stronger than their words. All eyes turned toward the hills, where shadows moved in the distance, a line of riders slowly approaching under the rising sun. He stood frozen, torn between two worlds, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman's words echoed in his mind. The law she spoke of, the spirits she said were watching. The villagers' shouts rose around him, a storm of fear and anger. And from the hills, the riders came closer, their drums beating louder, the tension twisting tighter with every passing moment. Everything had led to this, the rescue in the canyon, the whispers in the village, the warnings in the night. And now the moment had come, the moment where one choice, one action, could decide the fate of them all. The air itself seemed to tremble, thick with fear and expectation, as the riders drew nearer and the village stood ready to break. The woman's hand brushed lightly against his arm, steady, unshaken. "Now," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "Now you must decide." The drums grew louder, rolling down the hills like thunder, each beat making the ground feel alive beneath their feet. The villagers stood frozen, rifles trembling. In their hands, eyes wide with fear. The councilman shouted for calm, the preacher cried out prayers, but nothing silenced the panic swelling in the crowd. Mothers clutched their children, men shifted uneasily, and the air carried the raw weight of a choice that could not be delayed. From the ridge, the riders emerged, dark figures against the pale morning sky. Their horses moved in perfect rhythm, their faces painted, their spears gleaming in the light. The Apache had come. They did not ride fast, nor did they shout. They came with steady purpose, each drumbeat a warning and a promise. The woman beside him stood tall, her chin lifted, her gaze unbroken. She showed no fear, only certainty. The councilman turned to him, his face pale but angry. "You brought this upon us," he said. "You and her. If we all die today, it will be your fault." The words struck him, but he did not answer. Instead, he looked at her, the woman whose life he had saved, the woman whose law had bound them. She placed her hand on his arm, steady and calm. "Do not fear," she said quietly. "Fear is what destroys before a battle even begins." The riders stopped at the edge of the village, a wall of stillness. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then one rider dismounted, an older man with eyes as sharp as flint. He walked forward slowly, stopping just short of the gathered crowd. His gaze swept over the villagers, then rested on her. "My daughter," he said in his own tongue, the words low but carrying. She stepped forward, her face lighting not with joy, but with solemn recognition. "Father," she replied, her voice steady. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The villagers looked to one another in confusion, fear twisting into something sharper. The preacher muttered about trickery, the blacksmith cursed under his breath. Yet none dared move. The old man's eyes turned to him then, hard and unyielding. "You saved her life," he said, his voice now in broken English, sharp but clear. "And by our law, you are bound." The weight of the words pressed on him like stone. He nodded slowly, though he felt every eye in the village burning into his back. "I did," he admitted. The old man studied him for a long moment, then spoke again. "Then you are tied to her fate as she is tied to yours. That is the way of things." The villagers broke into whispers, their voices trembling with fear and disbelief. The councilman shouted, "We will not accept this. She cannot stay here." The old man's gaze snapped to him, and in that instant, the air seemed to grow colder. "This is not your choice," he said. Tension hung heavy, the kind that could spark violence with the smallest misstep. The villagers clutched their rifles. Tighter, the Apache shifted on their horses, and for a moment it seemed the entire world balanced on a single thread. Then the woman stepped forward, placing herself between both sides. "No blood today," she said firmly, her voice carrying. "There has been enough already." Her father looked at her, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he nodded. "Then we honor the law," he said. "He is bound to you, and through you, bound to us." The meaning of his words settled heavy in the air. The villagers, pale and restless, began to understand. This was no simple return, no farewell. This was a union neither side had asked for, but one that carried the weight of sacred law. The council protested, but their voices rang hollow against the drums that still echoed in the distance. One by one, the Apache riders turned and began to retreat, leaving only the old man and his daughter standing before the villagers. Finally, he too mounted his horse. Before riding away, he gave a single look at the man who had saved her, a look that held both challenge and respect. Then he turned, and the drums faded into the hills once more. Silence fell heavy over the village. The people looked at him and at her, their faces caught between fear and resentment. The councilman spat into the dirt. "You've tied us to them," he said coldly. "Don't think we'll forgive that." Yet no one moved against them. The villagers dispersed slowly, muttering under their breath, casting glances full of suspicion. By sundown, the streets were empty again, and the weight of the day hung thick in the air. Back at the cabin, he sat in silence by the fire. She knelt. Nearby, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes steady as always. "It is done," she said softly. "Is it?" he asked, his voice low, heavy with doubt. "The village hates me now. They'll never trust me again." "They do not have to trust you," she replied. "The law is not theirs. It is ours. What matters now is the path ahead." He looked at her, searching her face for some sign of what that path meant. "And what is that?" he asked. She held his gaze, her eyes deep as the night sky. "Balance," she said simply. "The spirits gave you my life. Now we must give back. Together." Her words carried more than duty. They carried the weight of truth. And in that moment, he understood. His life would never again be what it had been. The quiet days of anonymity were gone. He was no longer just a man drifting through a small village. He was bound to her, bound to something greater, something older than fear or hatred. The following weeks brought no peace. The villagers kept their distance, their whispers sharper than knives. Yet the threats did not return. The Apache did not attack, nor did the riders appear again. The fear that had hung like a storm slowly began to ease, though suspicion lingered like smoke. He and the woman lived quietly in the cabin, working side by side, bound not only by the law but by the slow, steady rhythm of survival. In time, the villagers began to see them less as danger and more as a presence they could not drive away. The doctor continued to offer his aid. The baker's daughter still left bread at their door. Small gestures chipped away at the walls of hatred. Though the wounds of mistrust were deep, through it all, the woman remained steadfast. She sang her soft songs in the evenings, taught him words in her language, and spoke often of the law of balance. Slowly, he came to understand. Saving her had not been an accident nor a curse. It had been a turning, a moment where fate shifted the course of his life. The seasons changed. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the promise of spring, and with it came a quiet sense of renewal. The village still watched him with wary eyes, but they no longer raised rifles when he passed. And the woman, once a stranger, had become the steady presence at his side, her strength guiding him through every uncertain step. He thought often of the drums, of the way the earth had seemed to tremble beneath their beat. He wondered if they would return, if the Apache would come again. But deep down, he knew that even if they did, the choice he had made would remain the same. He had saved her life, and in doing so, had bound his own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, she spoke once more of the sacred law. "The child we bring into this world will be more than yours or mine," she said. "It will be the bridge between two worlds. A life given for a life saved. That is balance." Her words filled him with a weight he could not name: fear, hope, responsibility. Yet, as he looked at her, standing strong against the fading light, he felt something else too. A quiet certainty. The story that began in violence and fear had led him here, to a place he never expected to be. Now not by choice, but by something greater: sacred law, ancient balance, and the unshakable truth that life is never truly our own. And as night settled once more over the village, he realized that while the path ahead would not be easy, it was no longer one he would walk alone. For she was beside him, and through her, so too were the spirits that watched, waiting, always waiting, for the balance to be kept. The drums had faded. The fear had not fully gone, but a new beginning had taken root in the silence that followed. And in that silence lay the truth that would guide them both. You save a life, and in return, life binds you forever.